Okay, and welcome back to another episode of It's All Interesting. My guest today, the great David D. Chapman. David, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. I'm wearing purple in honor of the purple swing states that seem to be dwindling in this election. So we are 11 days out. State of the race. David, where are we?
At this point, we're not so much poll watching as we are early vote watching. Mark Halprin and a lot of people are starting to say and sound the alarm bells, but I think that people behind the scenes aren't stupid; they can see it too. Um, that there are certain states that Democrat listen. The way early voting works is that this is the Democrats' time. They lead. We're not supposed to be leading. Now, I'm not saying that the Republicans are leading everywhere, but for some reason, the Republicans are leading in Nevada, in Arizona, and in North Carolina. And that's not supposed to be happening. Turnout is way down among Democrats. And if you look at in Georgia, now they don't have partisan data. But if you, based on the turnout down there, if you assume everybody votes the way they voted again in 2020, based off of turnout, that's Trump +5 down there.
And do we know in Georgia where people are voting? I know that may sound like a silly question, but we know the districts they're voting in, and we know the do we
Rural,
know right, and do we know
rural.
and so we know the historical vote of those
Yep,
areas, correct?
yep, yep. That's exactly what we're talking about here. It's the same with North Carolina. The vote is coming harder out of the rural areas than it is coming out of, like, say, Asheville or name another city out of
Raleigh,
North Carolina.
Raleigh, right? Raleigh
Yeah,
or
Raleigh.
Charlotte. Yeah.
Exactly. It's coming harder out of the rural areas. One of the worries is North Carolina going to vote because they got hit by a
Right.
hurricane. I think I said on this podcast before, it never affects things historically. If people want to vote, they're going to vote. And the government always gives you an opportunity to vote. They legally have to. So they made arrangement. They have like mobile buses now to where they just take that to that area. These people are voting. They got nothing else to do
Right.
but clean up their stuff and vote. So they're voting, and they're voting in large numbers.
Right. So
Um,
are we seeing anything specifically? I know you just mentioned specifically in the western areas of North Carolina where the storm really hit the hardest.
um, so I would the turnout.
Yeah.
It's high.
Yeah.
It's high. There's nothing to be worried about with North Carolina. Like I said briefly, last I checked. Now again, it has not updated from yesterday's for today, so I
Hmm.
put that with a caveat. But last I checked, Republicans were leading in early voting in North Carolina, um, which is unusual.
Right.
Um, but so I would say North Carolina is probably gone. Okay. I would
And
say that
let me before we get into the individual states, let me just ask
yeah.
you generally. I understand you're saying North Carolina may be gone. You're probably going to say Nevada may be gone for
Oh,
the hair.
Nevada is gone.
Okay.
Nevada
All
is
right.
gone.
All right. So before we get into those individual states, let me ask you then, why can't the argument be made? Two-part question. Part one. Why can't the argument be made that the GOP, who now seems to be getting their act together in mail-in votes and early voting, as they haven't in years past, couldn't the argument be made that they're just cannibalizing their votes? And because we're not in a 2020 pandemic year, that more Democrats are going to vote in person and that the difference could be made up just as the Republicans attempted to do in 2020.
I mean, you could make that argument. Anybody can make that argument. But the truth is that Democrats have always voted early, and their research has showed that the party voters always follow what the party leaders say on strategy. That's why in 2020 everybody voted on election day because we were trying to beat the steal, and that actually turned out to be a very bad strategy. Whereas the party leaders for the Democrats are always vote early, vote early, vote early, so they vote early. Um, with Republicans, it's a tradition. They vote on election day. However, there's a lot of people who are, in fact, taking the advice of the party leaders in the Republican Party and are voting early more often. But I don't expect that suddenly there will be less. So there might be some less. There's probably some cannibalization. However, as we see in Pennsylvania and in Virginia, that a lot of the early voting is coming from low propensity and first time voters.
So how do we know that exactly? Is that just from the raw data that we're getting?
So if you use Target Smart, you can use the click on frequency of voters, and they essentially power a voter.
Okay. So we can
Yeah,
tell
so
basically
you
who's
can
voting, who voted in
it's
the
all
last election, last two
it's all
elections.
public data.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
you just gotta know where to look.
So in that regard, why do you think, or how do you think it's come to pass that the GOP has now embraced early and mail-in voting? Because traditionally, as you said, this was not something that they have done. So what do you think has made up for that difference?
It's more of a turnout. They're targeting low propensity voters, and betting on low propensity voters and a massive turnout on election day is a terrible strategy, because getting low propensity and first time voters out takes time,
Mm,
and you need a month or two to do it. Getting them all out on one day is
right.
not going to happen. Um,
So now this is a question of resources, basically, right?
yeah,
Because I think the
yeah,
argument would be made for both sides, right? You get somebody to vote early, that's somebody you can check the box and you do not have to bother them
right.
however
Yep,
many days leading up to the election, right? So that means you can have your people on the ground
yep.
focusing on people that haven't voted yet. And we've heard so much about the Democrat ground game in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in all of these swing states. In your mind, has the Republican ground game gotten better? Or with this early and mail in vote, have the Democrats, is there just, what do you think is causing this?
Well, with the Republicans, the ground game is better. Anytime Trump's on the ballot, the turnout is going to be better because he's a one man turnout machine. But then they have the early voting efforts. Now, they don't actually have an in house turnout game or ground game, but they have several third party organizations like Charlie Kirk's Turning Point in Michigan and now Pennsylvania, because they've got the funding. 10x votes is doing a great job. And these people are, and also Elon Musk's super PAC. They're all doing great, turning out the vote, voting early, voter registration. Also, there's one in Georgia that a lot of people won't probably want to mention, but Kelly Loeffler's super PAC in Georgia is she's actually registered like 40,000 people in Georgia. So I mean, not exactly our friend, but thanks for the help. So but on the Democrat side, how good is their ground game? Listen, part of a ground game is enthusiasm, and there's no enthusiasm for her. If there really was a lot of enthusiasm, there would have been a surge at the beginning. These numbers in the early voting wouldn't be like this. Also, if you're reading the Politico stories or the Milwaukee Sentinel story from 2 weeks ago, they don't really have confidence in their ground game in the Rust Belt.
Mm.
Um, Pennsylvania, according to the rumors in Politico, is in disarray, and she's not working well with mayors to turn out votes. And in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Sentinel reported that they're worried that their ground game might inadvertently turn out Trump voters, because Trump voters are now the low propensity voters, and the Democrat turnout machine targets those and has for decades. It's really hard to all of a sudden you find out in polling that your voter is no longer the low propensity voter, and you didn't expect that to happen. So how can you be prepared with your turnout game when you didn't know it was going to happen? That's where the Democrats are right now, is that they didn't really have time to change their turnout game. So when they're turning out voters and he souls to the polls and everything, they're going to accidentally turn out some Trump voters. It's just going to happen.
So, North Carolina, I think the raw vote, as you said, the raw data so far shows a Republican lead. Has not happened probably in maybe 20 plus years. Um, Nevada, we're seeing the rural areas come out, which eats in to the Clark County
Right.
area where a lot of the Union strong Democrat votes are. Is that correct?
And yeah, and right now with the overall lead by Republicans across the state, Harris could win independents. I think the last count by Eric Daughtry was that they could win it by Democrats could win by 10 by independents in the state, and Trump would still win the state. That's how big of a lead they have. That's assuming everybody votes
Right.
along party line,
Right.
which won't happen. But
Okay. Well, I think on both sides, right? You're going to get either disaffection,
yeah,
or you're going to get just people that are registered with a party for the
right.
last 20, 30 years that just tend to vote the other way anyway.
Yep.
You probably have people that are registered Republican from the 90s that vote Democrat, and people that are registered as Democrat from the 80s that vote Republican.
There's a lot of that in North Carolina too. A lot of old Democrats who vote Republican at the presidential level.
All right, Arizona. Do we have any data on that?
Republicans are leading, which is again surprising because this is the Democrats' time and they're not getting the vote out now. The early vote started recently in Arizona. They start later. However, it looks like the Republicans are up about 50,000. I just checked like 10 minutes ago,
Mm-hmm.
50,000
Hmm.
over the Democrats in total turnout as of yesterday.
So
So,
are there any places right now where she's doing well? I think in the early vote, from what we can glean from Michigan, she might be doing well from the amount of ballots that have been returned in certain areas. And I know on some breakdown level, there was a wide gender gap where a lot of female voters have returned their votes already in Michigan, which would tend to believe that the Harris camp is doing better there.
well, I would also add on the gender gap. Another thing that I noticed in Nevada was that it's 2 points more male
Hmm.
than female, which was flipped in 2020. So anytime that a state is going to be 2 points or even 1 point more male, it's probably going to be a good news for Trump.
Okay, so based on everything you're talking about, then, are we looking at, it seems like we're getting down to a blue wall or bust scenario. Because even if Trump carries the entire Sun Belt from North Carolina, Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
Arizona to Nevada, if Harris is able to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that gets her directly to 270 if
Right.
she holds on to the Nebraska congressional district. So what is your thought in terms of those three states of a sweep for the Harris camp?
Well, first of all, her winning only 270 would be atypical for a Democrat because if you go all the way back to the Civil War, every Democrat, with the exception of Wilson in 1916, has won the Electoral College comfortably when they win. Some of them have been slightly under 300, like Jimmy Carter, 297. In the 1890s, I mean, they won like 219, 223, but that was when you only needed 200 electoral votes. But my point is that her winning only 270, what historical precedent? There's always a first, but that would be very weird. In terms of the blue wall, um, it's very hard to see her winning Pennsylvania. When you look at the early voting, and compared to this point in 2020, they're missing about 300,000 mail in ballots or stuff, that they're about short 300,000 in turnout. And the Republicans are about 50,000 higher at this point in turnout. Again, that 50,000 could be cannibalized,
Hmm.
but um, that's not the case on the Democrats. They're short about 300,000, and Biden only won by 80,000 votes.
Well, what's interesting and what I have found extraordinarily interesting is that, look, I'm not an insider. I'm not Rich Barris. I'm not Robert Barnes. I'm not the guy from Trafalgar. I don't know any of the internals. What I do know is Bob Casey is running ads featuring Donald Trump and Joe Biden and not Kamala Harris.
Yep.
That would just signal to me as a logical person that there is internal information on the Democratic side that they somehow need to show that they are, whether Casey or whomever, need to have some type of alliance with some of the Trump era policies. And they're not campaigning with Team Harris. So forget about polling, because now we're looking at raw data. But just that alone would seem to me that there's problems for the Harris camp in Pennsylvania if Bob Casey, for his reelection, is running ads featuring Donald Trump.
Tammy Baldwin did the same thing in Wisconsin as well, and then a couple of weeks ago, Alyssa Slotkin did the same thing in Michigan too. She's Harris has become very toxic in the Midwest for these Democrats. Um, if you go back to July, we were looking at a scenario where all of these Democrats were going to lose their Senate seats because of Joe Biden. We are conceivably not approaching pre-debate Joe Biden, but now approaching post-debate Joe Biden.
So do you think then we could see, and it seems like some of these Democratic Senate candidates are banking on historic ticket splitting numbers, whether that's in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, even Nevada, and places like that?
They're banking on it. Like I said before, though, it would be very historically atypical because only Susan Collins has bucked that trend. The idea that someone like Sherrod Brown would run 8 points apart from Trump is not possible. Bernie Moreno is most likely going to win that seat. If Trump is going to win Pennsylvania by 3 points, like some of these more recent polls, like for Barris or Atlas Intel, or even Trafalgar or Insider Advantage, are suggesting about a 2 to 3 point win, there's no way that Dave McCormick doesn't win that seat, especially if it's already tied now. A 2 point win for Trump would carry him over it, maybe by 1 point.
So, all right. So let's look at those Senate races then. So I think we can comfortably say Montana's now gone. Do you agree
It's
with
been
that?
gone. Yeah, it's been gone for a while.
Okay. So we have Montana, West Virginia, and that would give the Republicans a 51-49 majority. So now I think in terms of the NRSC, they're probably looking at expanding that map. So we have Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada. Of those four, which do you think likely the Democrats can hold? Which do you think likely the Republicans can pick up?
I would say it's likely. So Trump's gonna probably win Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona. Um,
Oh, right.
the one,
Let's include Arizona in that list. So Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. Jackie Rosen, just to start off in Nevada, has had and maintained a pretty comfortable lead there.
yeah, that's where I was going. That of the likely Democrat holds, it's probably Nevada, where Trump wins Nevada and he holds on by a point. Whereas the toss-up, for some surprising reason, seems to be Arizona, because Lake is running so far behind Trump. However, I do think it's possible that the Republicans do sweep those Senate seats in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. And then some of the other, I guess, lesser paid attention to races. New Hampshire, not New Hampshire, I'm sorry. The Virginia Senate race. There's not a lot of polling, there's not a lot of movement there, but the GOP has really dominated the early vote there, unlike years past. So, is there any way that there could be a surprise, you think, in the Virginia race?
Only if Trump wins the state by 2 or 3 points, which is unlikely. It would be a bigger surprise if Trump won the state. Although, like I talked about just a few minutes ago, we might be approaching post debate Joe Biden. There's talks that Trump is now going to do a rally in Minnesota, Virginia, and New Mexico. Um,
There were two
so,
New Mexico polls that came out the other day. One, Trump Harris +9, and then the other
yeah,
was +3, even though that was a very small sample size.
yeah. Yeah, but I mean, they might be seeing something different. And also, there's a chance that a lot of these polls could be off if they miss on his Hispanic support.
Mm, mm. Now, before we got on, you were talking about New Hampshire. I know we're bouncing over, bouncing a little bit. What are you looking at in terms of the early vote in New Hampshire, a state that really nobody is focusing on?
Yeah, although I think the Democrats are focusing on it because Biden just had two stops up there nonchalantly. Nobody even realized it until he made a huge gaffe and said, let's put Trump in jail. And then everybody realized what he said, but no one really realized he was in New Hampshire. And I didn't even realize he made two stops in New Hampshire. But there's a reason for that. If you go look at the early voting, the Democrats are about, at this point in 2020 versus now, they're missing about 60,000 votes that were banked in 2020 versus now. And at this point versus 2020, in 2020, they had a 45,000 vote lead in the early voting. Today, they only have a 2,000 vote lead in the early voting. So that is probably why Biden, very quietly, until he made the gaffe, went into New Hampshire and was campaigning. Um, so it's almost unfathomable that one, their turnout is that low in a state that should be a gimme, but that the Republicans are so close to them.
So it seems like, just from optics, it seems like the Harris team is trying to, I know is trying to defend states, whereas the Trump team maybe is now looking at potentially expanding the map. With that being said, Harris team going to Texas tomorrow. Senate race, very close there. Is there any data supporting there could be an upset in either the Electoral College or the Senate race?
Okay, so Ted Cruz tends to underpoll but overvote, so he always overperforms the polls. Um, what she's doing there is that there's a chance, like I said, that the Republicans sweep the Senate seats in the Midwest, and so they think, oh well, the polls are close. We got to go get that Senate seat because it's going to get really bad. So it's the same reason she's going a few other places too. It's saving down ballot races. That's where they're at right now. They know they're going to lose, and they're trying to save the Senate. They're trying to save the House. That's why she's going to Texas and not Pennsylvania or not Georgia. You know, why would someone trailing waste a stop in Texas
Now,
down ballot races?
what about Florida? Is there? I know that Florida Senate race was close. You had indicated previously on this program Rick Scott's gonna come out ahead, probably by
Yeah.
at least a few points. Is that where the data has trended?
I listen. Trump's going to win Florida by about 10 points. There's no way that Rick Scott trails 9 points behind him.
Yeah.
He's going to win by at least 7.
Mm, All right. So you mentioned the House and down ballot races. So obviously, a lot of close Senate races to keep an eye on. The House. Do we have any indication of where the House could go? And let me ask it this way. If Trump wins, is it likely the House would just follow him? And if Harris wins, is it likely the House would just follow her? Are we looking at a situation where whoever wins the election, the House would follow that person?
More than likely, yes. It's no matter who wins the election, the Republicans likely take the Senate because of how this who's up and who isn't. But with the House, you're probably looking at a scenario where, especially if Trump wins the popular vote, there might be a bigger margin that they win. He's been campaigning in New York and California for a reason because they're competitive House seats, and he's got the luxury to do it. And going to California and New York, he believes winning the popular vote would be nice too, which is becoming a very much a reality. It looks like he could actually do that. You
Hmm.
look at RCP; she's only up by 0.2 in
So
the average.
what do you make of the notion that's out there that essentially right wing or writer leaning polls have flooded the zone to make it appear that Trump is doing better in the polling?
Well, these polls aren't right wing polls; they're just honest polls. They don't lean to the left, they don't lean to the right. They miss in both ways, as opposed to the media and university polls always miss, and the error going in favor of Republicans. However, part of these averages skewing hard to the right now has a lot to do with, if you've noticed, a lot of these pollsters have decided to do their final poll in early October,
Mm.
when traditionally they do their final poll at the first week of November, as close to the race as they can. But now they're deciding to do it early in October, so possibly they don't catch Trump leading, or for whatever reason. But that leaves it open to the rest of the people who are still polling and now finding Trump momentum to be thrown into the average, while RMG and all these people who have been favorable to Harris have already done their final poll. They're done, right? So they're not really skewing it. These left polls are now sitting out.
Well, and I noticed something. So in the Quinnipiac poll that came out yesterday, I think
Yeah.
regarding Michigan, and then also the Wall Street Journal poll that came out yesterday in the national race. Each one of them had different sample sizes for the Democrat electorate versus the Republican electorate. So they both shifted the electorate sample size. So why do pollsters do that? Is it really just a matter of they just can't get the same sample that they got previously?
I think that most pollsters are still suffering from a low response rate.
Yeah.
Getting the right amount of samples is hard. But as Rich Barris would say, if you can't get the number of responses, you just stay in the field. But as we've talked about before, these media and university polls, they have a set budget. When they hit that budget, that's it. If they don't have enough responses after they hit that budget, there's not much they can do. Where they're not,
I,
it's not like they're,
I
yeah.
know Nate Silver said don't pay attention to the crosstabs, but I feel like the crosstabs are super important.
The
Yeah, go ahead.
crosstabs will
Yeah.
predict more than the top line. I always say the top line is the least predictive part of a poll,
Mm,
because the top line is almost always off by a point or 2 points, and it's the one thing that we notice is off.
mm, mm. All right. 11 days out. What are you looking at? What should we continue to look at?
Just watch early voting this Sunday. There will likely be a surge in early voting for Democrats. Their souls to the polls as early voting in a lot of states start to wrap up, because a lot of them stop on November 1st. So there'll be a huge push by Democrats this weekend. I imagine there might be one more October surprise, making it 3 straight nights. They're just going to keep throwing things until something sticks. But the reason why I think this night will be the last night that they do it, they won't drop something on a Friday night because it'll die
Mm.
over the
Well,
weekend.
traditionally, that's the worst day for a news cycle to hit.
Right. And so tonight would like be the last. And then next week, if they hadn't been able to create a news cycle out of the scandals, next week they don't have time. It's 7 days until the election. It'll be time to abandon her and save themselves.
All right. So, as you said, the best sign for Republicans right now is the numbers in the early voting and the numbers in the mail in returns. In a week from now, if the Democrats were to have a very good sign for them, what would that be?
If this weekend's voter surge is like everything that they dreamed of, that's pretty much all that they can hope for. Or if miraculously everybody who hasn't been voting for Democrats decided, I'm going to vote on election day. I'm going to pretend I'm a Republican and I'm going to vote on election day, which is unlikely, but we've seen more unlikely things before. That's all they can hope for, is the votes got to come somewhere. But it's not just that they need more votes. They need less Republican votes, because Republicans are voting at too high of rates right now.
All right, David, we'll leave it at that. I'll give you the floor for your own promotion. Go right ahead.
Seth Levy returns tonight for the show. It's gonna be a nerd podcast. It's all early voting and polls.
All right.
That's essentially what we're doing.
All right, check out David's show, The Chapman Show on YouTube. He's a good follow on X as well. David, thank you always for your time. I'm sure we're going to catch up next week.